and the show's head curator, Alfred Barr Jr., was idolized as the Pope of modernism. And by sponsoring this event, he had elevating Cuban art to the heavens of legitimacy. Barr traveled to Cuba in 1943 to personally inspect the island's artistic movement. He then acquired a substantial group of Cuban paintings, for near nothing, I might add, for the MoMA's permanent collection. And upon his return to New York, he enthusiastically proposed the show to the museum board, defended its merits, he had to defend it, and later organized the exhibition. Barr's commitment to Cuban art went further. He wrote an introduction to the exhibition catalog, where he validated the art of the island by stating, and I quote, "There are things in Cuba which surprise you. The modern movement in Havana is very young. In fact, it has taken on a consistent and recognizable character only within the past 4 or 5 years. It has something of the brashness, but even more of the virtues of youth, courage, freshness, vitality, and a healthy disrespect for its elders." End of quote. The MoMA not only put together the exhibition, which included a total of 13 artists and 75 artworks. The museum went further by offering the show to other museums in different cities of the United States. This is not a well-known fact. A somewhat edited version of the MoMA show, Modern Cuban Painters, composed of 66 works, traveled immediately afterwards, from 1944 to 1945, to 12 other museums throughout the United States, including the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the San Francisco Museum of Art, and the Seattle Museum. The exhibition in New York and its other venues was accompanied by a 200-page book on Cuban art, written mostly by Jose Gomez. The impact of these events totally altered the dynamics for Cuban modern art. The international art market began to pay attention. Prior to 1943, the painters of the Cuban modern art movement had an extremely limited collecting market for their creations. In the island, few art sales at very low values sold. The upper-class Cuban families, known for their artistic sophistication, did not consider Cuban avant-garde art worthy of consideration. The Cuban vanguardia, young, rebellious, iconoclastic, anti-dictatorial, and leftist, was best kept at a distance. In reality, these families of hereditary rank, some aristocrats, others of newfound wealth, did not pay attention to Cuban art in general. Their attention was placed elsewhere, outside the island and its autochthonous cultural output. I have a list of names, of families, and what they collected, but we'll have to sacrifice that. In the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, early 40s, the vanguardias hardly sold their works. Artists lived in poverty or near poverty, barely surviving from limited family assistance and frugal inheritances, such as Amelia Peláez, Carlos Enríquez, Antonio Gatorno, Cundo Bermúdez, Marcelo Pogolotti, or B, by bartering their paintings for food, lodging, or medical attention. Examples, Fidelio Ponce, Victor Manuel Garcia, Jose Mijares. And in other cases, from temporary additional jobs, most of them menial. René Portocarrero, Eduardo Abela, Luis Martínez Pérez. In the early years, the few collectors who actually paid something for the works were mostly the professional class, middle class, medical doctors, attorneys, architects, university professors, diplomats, and small business owners. I'll have to sacrifice the names. It was not until the international modern art community opened up to the vanguardias, starting in the mid-1940s, that these artists found financial support that permitted their better development and their enhanced artistic productivity. I will quote from Jose Rodriguez Feo, a very significant intellectual writer, literary critic, translator, co-founder, and co-director of the magazine Orígenes, as he published in Revista Bohemia in 1961. Quote, "When I met Portocarrero in the year 1944, I was surprised by the difficulties he had in selling his works in Cuba, and how, from the very beginning, the majority of his paintings ended up in foreign hands, who were the great admirers of his art. It is because of this that with Portocarrero, as well as with the other great painters of his generation, there are more works in foreign galleries and foreign private collections than the ones that exist in our own country." End of quote. It was an ironic turn of events that Cuban modern art was first decisively embraced by the international art establishment, especially in the United States, before reaching a higher level of recognition in its own country. Nadie profeta en su tierra. The aura of the MoMA show and the arrival of the Cuban avant-garde in the United States had other ramifications. Please observe the list of major New York galleries that signed up, directly represented and exhibited Cuban artists in the United States in the mid-1940s. The Pierre Matisse Gallery, the #1 New York gallery for modern art in the 1940s, represented Wilfredo Lam. The Julian Levy Gallery from New York represented René Portocarrero. The Fagel Gallery from New York represented Mariano Rodriguez. The Pearls Gallery, also from New York, and these are all very important galleries of the period. They represented two Cuban artists, Martínez Pedro and Mario Carreño. And the Passeidot Gallery, also from New York, represented Antonio Gatoro. These and other galleries significantly contributed to conform a base of U.S. art collectors. Most important, these artists were not being presented as Ricky Ricardo Cubans, but as legitimate international modernists, in conjunction with other well-known Cuban modern masters. Wilfredo Lam exhibited a two-artist exhibition with Pablo Picasso in New York. Additionally, other U.S. collectors frequently went to Havana, as they're doing now, to meet with artists and choose their preferences. Some of the better-known international collectors, there's a very long list, but I should certainly mention people like Ernest Hemingway, John Passos, Nelson Rockefeller, Alfred Hitchcock, Meyer Lansky, by the way, and David Harrington, and others. By the end of the 1940s, Cuban modern art had reached a level of consolidation that foretold its continued ascendancy in the international art arena. Let us review what New York Times principal art critic of the 1940s, Edward Alvin Jewell, wrote in his newspaper column on September 7, 1947, after a 2-week visit to Havana. Quote, "I found a modern art movement of considerable range and robustness. That there is a Cuban school recognizable as such could scarcely, I should say, be missed." And Jewell continues, "Most emphatic is the impact created by its nativeness, allied with high color and a certain impetuous, uninhibited zest in brushwork. Wash has become a medium possessing peculiar appeal for the Cuban artists, who swing it and make it sing for all its worth. Wash seems the happy preference of the Cuban modern artist. Alfred Barr continued to support the Cuban modernist movement, and by the late 1940s had recommended Dr. Jose Gomez Sicre and helped him secure the position of Chief of the Visual Arts Unit of the Organization of American States, OAS, in Washington, D.C. Barr had recognized the advice and the help that Gomez Sicre had given him in the 1944 exhibition, and it was then that he returned the favor. Gomez Sicre continued to push for the advancement of the arts in his country from his new position of authority in Washington, D.C. He put together, in 12 years, he put together 11 major shows of Cuban art in the Washington, D.C. area. And some of these shows were not only cultural, but they were also commercial, as was the custom in some museums to help the artists of modernism in the early days when it was so difficult to place the works. All of the funds went to the artists, of course. Thanks to the generosity of my dear friend and renowned art historian Alejandro Andreus, we have in our files not only a copy of the exhibition catalog of the OAS show of 1952, 7 Cuban painters, but also the extremely rare copy of the annotated price list by Jose Gomez Sicre of the works in the show and what you could buy them for. The real pricing of these works will surprise you. For example, 4 large Amelia Pelaez washes on paper from 1944 to 1945 were being offered at $350 each. Adjusted for inflation, for those of us who don't know how to figure these things, $350 in 52 represent $3,232 today. Last May, an Amelia Pelaez wash on paper sold at auction in New York for $485,000. Similar pricing is found for other vanguardia artists in this document. And in spite of the valuation enhancements that happened because of the 1944 MoMA show, the New York galleries, and the visits of U.S. collectors to Cuba, still in 1952, Cuban art was very, very reasonable. In conclusion, we can summarize that by the end of the 1950s, before the Cuban Revolution occurred, Cuban modern art had reached a recognized level of consolidation in the international art world. The tenacity of the 2 generations of Cuban avant-garde artists who kept producing and believing in the early years while braving poverty, scorn, and isolation had paid off. Modern art from Cuba had arrived and was part of the international art dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Damien.
Hello, everyone, and like my colleagues, I too thank Cuban Research Institute and Jorge Duani and Juan Martinez for the opportunity to be here and to share this morning with so many wonderful friends and colleagues and students. It's a pleasure. So, as you can see, I'm going to do something a little different. For my students, you know it isn't different because this is what I do. When we were putting together these presentations and I spoke to Annalise and Ramon, and I knew that they were going to give you all of the information that you needed about this particular period of time that is the focus of our panel. So I thought, what are we going to do? And threw out some themes and what I could do to complement it. So I came up with the theme of women. And when we first started talking about this, it was, there might be 3 or 4 women that worked at this particular period of time. And I think this morning we have heard Mirta Cero, Amelia Pelaez, Concepcion was there. That was it, right? I think that was all the names of women that you've heard. But I actually came up with 8. 8. I'm not going to belabor you with the statistics about how many women were working in the various areas of the arts in Cuba and elsewhere. I think you all know that women have been left out of art history. And I have tried for many, many years, I don't want to tell you how many years, to put the women back. And that was always the reason for my courses about women in art, women in Latin American art, surrealist women in art, that they needed to be returned into the history that they really were a part of, but could not compete in a male-driven art world with the men. And if there were opportunities in an art book to, say you have 20 pages and you could only include 20 artists, and when you started to look at the artists and there were 4 or 5 women, who were going to get eliminated? The women were going to be eliminated. So this is kind of the story of what happened. So I thought it would be kind of fun if, I'll do this, or we do this. There. Okay. All right. So I went on this little detective project where I wanted to look at the system, the educational system, which of course is dominated by San Alejandro, and find out what the education system was like preparing these artists, all of these artists really, that we've been talking about, or certainly the majority of them, what the academy was all about and how women could or could not fit into what was happening in the academy. Because there's no way of talking about this period of time without talking about San Alejandro. So I started to do a little research about San Alejandro. I bothered Juan whenever I could, and Annalise was it, help me with this. I can't find the women at San Alejandro. And how many women were there, and when did they get in, etc. So I dug, and I found 8. And I have 8 artists, and 7 of them were involved with San Alejandro, either as students or as teachers. So that's kind of the thread that weaves in throughout my presentation. So here are some of the facts about San Alejandro that I won't repeat to you. You could read it, and we've actually heard much of this information already. And here. So what I wanted to do was find the women artists, and only a handful practiced successfully in Cuba from 1900 to 1950. And of course, there might have been many women working on the arts and in the arts, in their homes, in studios, in small spaces. But the ones that I was really interested in were the ones that had a successful practice. In other words, they were out in the public. They were recognized at their time. So the 8 artists that I've come up with are successful in that particular respect. So here is my list. They're born before 1930, and who worked into the 1990s. So you can see they're born all the way back into 1880, and Maria Arisa y Delance, Concepcion Ferrand, whose image Annalise had, Luisa Fernandez Morel, Amelia Pelaez, of course, Mirta Serra. We do have, I don't think it's here, but we do have a Mirta Serra in the Frost Art collection from the Perez collection. Rita Longa, Uber Solis, and Gina Pilon. So these are the artists that I found, all of whom have had recognition in their day. And I think that you're going to be kind of surprised when you see the work. And so what I have is a really visual story here, so that you can see their work and what they did. And hopefully, as I introduce these artists to you, you won't forget them. And you'll know that there were women that were part of the School of Havana. So it's a typical story about how women were left out of the history books and that their opportunities were very limited to get into the art schools, and then once they were in the art schools, to progress into the necessary exhibits that would make them successful and recognized. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. So just to, talk about San Alejandro and the beginnings of San Alejandro that have been alluded to by both Annalise and Ramon, that it was very traditional. I mean, this was an academic system, and it was very traditional, and the portraiture, landscapes were the dominant themes. At San Alejandro, art and the artists it was very popular, and it was a very respected academy. It attracted students, and I'm going to move here, see what I'm saying here. It attracted students from throughout Cuba to Havana, and most of the women whose names I mentioned had connections in order to get into it. It was very competitive to enter into the academy. It was a rigorous curriculum. Realistic representational was definitely dominant. Drawing from classical models was the way of the academic system, and live models as well. So we know that with that academic system that starts in France and it moves to Spain and it moves really through many countries of the world, that students are given a very rigorous background. It starts with drawing, and then they progress from there. In 1879, only male students were allowed, similar to France, and its limited number of female students. And then finally, when the director, Miguel Miloro, was put in charge of it, he admitted women as full matriculating students, but there were very few. And this is my quest. I am still looking. Annalise brought me a book today. Juan has recommended. When this paper comes out, then I'm going to have some of those statistics. So who were they? How many? We can only count this few as evidence, right? So there were other 19th century trends that were part of what was happening in this particular period of time that we don't want to ignore. And again, both Annalise and Ramon have talked about this. There were other less conservative trends, the modernism of the European language, and naturalism and romanticism coming from Europe, but now about the people and the places of Cuba. And this is where really the very beautiful and so important landscape tradition emerges as well. So here's a Chartrand Cuban scene from 1880 that is very much like what was happening in the United States of America with American scene painting of pretty much the same time. So the women artists, from conservative and academic to folkloric to independent to the avant-garde, there's a little bit of everything in my little small group. They represent numerous trends. They were popular with private clients, especially when they did portraits and landscape. That was kind of the entree to be able to do things that were popular and acceptable. And then once they became a little bit more sure of themselves and their careers, then they could emerge into other areas. Many had had exhibitions and they won scholarships and prizes. When I started to go back into the biographies of these artists, I thought, my gosh, look what they did. They were very accomplished, but you're not going to know these artists. No, they're gone. Not all, of course. Amelia Pelash, you know. So the 8 that I'm going to talk about are the ones that, have not been remembered, but hopefully you are going to remember. So let's start with Maria Arisa y Delance, 1880 to 1959. She was homeschooled. Then she went to Paris. She studied at the Julian Academy. She lived in Paris, Belgium, Spain, and Italy. This was a very sophisticated woman, well-traveled, sophisticated woman. When she returned to Havana, she had many exhibits in the Fine Arts Salon. In 1926, she joined the faculty of San Alejandro. And in 1931, she became the secretary of San Alejandro under Menecal. Her style was very much like French landscapes. She was familiar with what was going on in Europe. And as I said, the Cuban landscape tradition is significant. She was a contributor to this. Plein air painting, she learned that in France as well. She brought it back to Cuba and to her own landscape. Here's another example. Another artist, Concepcion Maria de la Asunción Ferrant Gomez, a painter of portraits, folklore, the people of Cuba, very well educated in Havana, New York, and Spain, on the faculty of San Alejandro, very few works known. But she certainly made an impact at that time because she did the images for the postage stamps. So it wasn't like she was a total nobody, but I couldn't find anything in looking for her work except this gardeners that she did in the stamps. Luisa Fernandez Morel also studied at San Alejandro, then in Italy. She returned to Cuba, joined the faculty of San Alejandro, brought back this loose brushwork, soft colors, the tendency towards abstraction, the love of the landscape, and the local scenery. So you can see one of her paintings there. This is another street in Havana. 20th century developments. We really get into the 20th century. Of course, now we know, as we've just heard, and I'm not going to repeat it because you know what happened in the 20th century and the changes leading up to the vanguardia, the return of the artists from Europe with their new ideas, and some of the artists that have been mentioned already, and finally Amelia Pelaez. There's the artist that right? So Amelia Pelaez, also a student at San Alejandro, a very quiet student. She began as a landscape painter. She went to New York to the Art Students League. She went to Paris, realized that Paris, you had to go to Paris in order to progress at all. And she did, and she came back with these wonderful ideas that she learned from the Russian futurists. She learned from the Parisian abstractionists, the Cubists. I mean, she really had a wonderful group of people that she surrounded herself with. And then, of course, in 1934, she returns to her neighborhood of Vivara, and new subjects emerge. She takes those French subjects, and they become Cuban subjects that you're all very familiar with. A mural that she did for the Hotel Havana Libre. Another stamp. I always think it's interesting when artists have a stamp. It puts them into a different category. And many of these artists did stamps. So you have to know somebody was paying attention, right? If they did a stamp. So her work inspired by architecture, stained glass, wrought irons, as she brought the lessons in Paris. So just to show you some of the things that inspired her work. And another mural that she did dedicated to San Juan Bosco. I don't think people are as aware of her murals as they are of her paintings, so I thought it would be kind of fun to put some of them up. And then I'm quickly going to show you some paintings. I think you're all familiar with her work and what she does. The working with the fragmentation, the cubist flatness, and of course, complexity in form and color, especially starting in the 1940s. Stamp, another stamp. Another stamp. So her work became increasingly more abstract, geometric abstraction. Mirta Serra, an artist, as I said, who's in the collection here, studied at San Alejandro, went to the Art Students League. She had exhibitions in Havana, Washington, and New York. So again, she had a reputation. She was recognized for her work, especially for these portraits, but also, as you're going to see, this is the one that's in the collection here, the girl with the hat, the interest in brushwork. Val Colm, also in our collection here at the Frost Art Museum. And she's moving more and more to extreme abstraction in her work, flat planes of color, bottles. It might be kind of surprising if you know her girl with the hat to know that she was actually working in this style of art as well. New ideas, very extreme abstraction that she presented. The next one is Rita Longa. She studied commercial art, briefly attended the San Alejandro Academy, but she considered herself pretty much self-taught. She was a sculptress, and the sculpture is found throughout Havana. It's really important. You probably never, if you're familiar with Havana, never knew who did these works. This is the zoo. I'm going to show you that. So she's one of the few women to do public art commissions, famous in her time for doing this work about the environment. Palace of Fine Arts, Havana, other work. Okay, so her name has disappeared, but look what she did. You know her. She did the sculpture for the Hatui logo. The Fountain of the Martyrs in Havana, family group of deer at the entrance to the zoo. The Taino Village Reconstruction Project, 25 sculptures in Matanza about the Tainos. A fantastic project, major project. So the next one, I've got like 1 minute to do this. Uber Solis, a very unique and personal style, described as Cuban Antillian, the sensitivity to her people, to the brushwork. She studied drawing at the School of Education in Havana, and she had exhibits in many places. So look at her work. I'll go really quickly through this. See the color? Very expressionistic. So we're really moving into the expressionistic tendencies of modernism. And then, I think, last but not least, Gina Payon, graduated from the Academy of San Alejandro, again, taught at the Polytechnic Institute, studied in France, overstayed her visa, fleeing from the Cuban dictatorship of Castro, and spent the rest of her life in